Psychological horrors, more often than not, focus on depicting the internal struggle of their protagonist and force them to face what they have done, sometimes for resolution, or at times simply for punishment. In these instances, the characters are aware of what they've done, they just can't face it. But what happens when the character can't remember? What happens when he can't trust the images his mind is showing him? Moreover, what if our character is a convicted, violent criminal? And what if instead of fighting creatures born from his psyche, he's forced to contend with the manifestations of all the horrors humans have inflicted upon one another in the place where he now resides? These are but some of the questions you'll explore in The Suffering. The Suffering was developed by the now-defunct Surreal Software and published by the also-defunct Midway Games, the original developers of Mortal Kombat. Lead designer Richard Rouse III described The Suffering as a stylized horror shooter, with fast gameplay like that of Devil May Cry, the horror of Resident Evil, and the immersive world of Half-Life. Thus, The Suffering forgoes the trappings of the survival horror genre, and instead is more of an action horror title, without overwrought cutscenes, clumsy controls, fixed camera angles, and sparse ammo pickups. They also wanted their protagonist to not be in any way considered frail, instead wanted to convey his strength, and so designed the character with something of a Neanderthal look, but with some ambiguity in terms of ethnicity. Another way The Suffering's design distanced itself from its counterparts was with the controls, specifically for the combat. They first implemented a target lock-on style of fighting, but when that didn't work, and taking inspiration from twin-stick shooters, they opted for a free-aim style shooting to emulate the feel of a keyboard and mouse on a PC. A major source of inspiration for the tone and storytelling was Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, described by Rouse as something deeply horrific, not cheesy or ridiculous, a serious piece that is intensely frightening. One aspect of the movie that had a tremendous impact on The Suffering is the visions, moments where a mundane environment transforms for a glimpse of a terrible truth. Another source of inspiration for both titles was Hitchcock's Birds, in terms of making it unclear why things happened, with characters having entirely different theories. Ben Olsen did the initial creature design, taking inspiration from the Cenobites from Hellraiser, the movies Freaks, and The Crippled Masters, as well as the works of artist Hans Belmer, with further work being done by Terry Wolfinger from Stan Winston Studios to make them more disturbing. Composer Eric Aho and lead designer Boyd Post worked together on the score and sound design of the game, based on a concept by Post, where instead of using traditional instruments, they would use objects made from the materials found in whatever part of the game world the player is in, so the music and sound effects bleed into and complement one another. An example of this is chapters that take place inside the prison, where the soundscape uses metal bars, trash cans, and even just the sound of metal scraping on metal. The Suffering would release in March 2004 to generally favorable reviews and a commercial success, and so, as is usually the case, work began on a sequel, The Suffering: Ties That Bind, which moved the action from the fictitious Carnet Island off the coast of Maryland to Baltimore. And while The Shining continued to be a primary influence, the developers not only took inspiration from other films such as Descent and The Others for their strong sense of claustrophobia and entrapment, as well as Rosemary's Baby, The Ring, The Grudge, and more, but also took great care in exploring the historical elements of Baltimore, such as the Underground Railroad and the city's prisons, with the goal of tapping into Baltimore's history, but also ensuring they wouldn't reflect actual events, but creating their own inspired by said history. The Suffering: Ties That Bind released in 2005 to generally favorable reviews, especially in terms of the more complex story and the exploration of morality, but met with both underwhelming sales and a general feeling that it was inferior to the first title. The Suffering Ties That Bind would also prove to be Surreal Software's final game. The Suffering takes place in Maryland, the first in a fictional island called Carnate, which is home to Abbott State Penitentiary, a maximum security prison where the state sends the worst inmates, including those heading straight for death row. Abbott State has a staggering amount of violence within its walls, which complements the island's own history of horrors, from a World War II prisoner of war camp to even its own flavor of the Salem trials. It's such a bad place that even the guards feel like they're prisoners at times. Torque, our main character, arrives on Carnate, given the death sentence for the murder of his entire family, his ex-wife Carmen and his boys Corey and Malcolm. Only Torque has no memory of the event and claims to suffer from blackouts, not that anyone believes him. And so there's some ambiguity as to whether Torque is truly guilty of their passing. But something that is very clear is that his violent and criminal past did have a negative influence on their lives. When Torque arrives on Carnate, something changes. A tremor is felt all around the island, something dubbed the Cataclysm, that awakens the nightmares of the island and the prison's history and brings them to life in the form of the game's enemies, the Malefactors. Creatures representing the many ways in which humans inflict suffering upon one another, such as the Slayers, your basic enemy, which represents death by decapitation, Mainliners, representing the lethal injection, and Burrowers, which represent those buried alive. Now Torque must try to find a way off the island, while also facing his own past and the many ghosts and monsters his arrival has awakened. The sequel, The Suffering, Ties That Bind, moves the action to Baltimore, where a similar situation, where the city's dark past is coming back to bite it, is taking place. Its malefactors now tied to the city's history, from violent gangs, drug trafficking, and even addiction. Some of the original malefactors return, now given a new coat of paint and tied to Baltimore instead of Carnate. For example, the Mainliners have a different look and now represent those addicted to drugs. Not only are the malefactors the monsters we face in combat, but there are also some individuals, specters, of people who left an indelible mark on history and so now manifest as new horrors, such as the Baltimore serial killer, the Creeper, the slave hunter Copperfield, and Carnate's foremost alienist, the Vincent Price-inspired Dr. Killjoy, who manifests through 16mm film projectors. Torque's own darkness has a way of manifesting in the form of the game's Insanity mode, where combat fills out a bar that when maxed out allows the player to transform Torque into a highly destructive beast, one that is as much part of the story as Torque himself. In fact, the sequel explores Torque's darkness far more than the first. The Suffering is one of the few horror series that avoids something I like to call the armory problem, where once the player has enough weaponry, everything becomes easy and the intensity of the combat and the horror relents. That's not something that happens in The Suffering, as even with an abundance of ammo and weapons, even a simple Slayer can take you out. Combat in The Suffering is always frenetic, it's always intense, and so deeply satisfying. Add to the mix the ability to Hulk out, the Insanity mode, and it getting its own upgrades along the way, and the result is some truly spectacular combat set pieces. The horror in The Suffering is prevalent. It's not dependent on jump scares. The atmosphere of the setting is oppressive, claustrophobic even, and this is inside the prison walls and outside. While there are flashing images at times, they're not meant as jump scares, but instead disturbing imagery to add to the tension and convey the character's disturbed mind. Similarly, the visions do the same, showing you interactions with Torque's dead family and moments of the land's past. Are those real or just in Torque's mind? Are you really surrounded by Slayers after turning that corner? Or is it a figment of your imagination? Yes, is the only answer I can give. And of course, The malefactors and their history, or what they represent, are genuinely disturbing, and in a way help make it so the action is not separate from the horror, but one complements the tension created by the other. And for those who want to know more, the games include journals created by secondary characters, with descriptions of the setting and its history and the malefactors themselves. It's one of the aspects of the Suffering I like the most, to be honest. One of the strengths of the Suffering's morality system is that it's very much active. It's not conversation choices or prompts where you decide if you'll be a good guy or not. Moral choices happen as you play. Sometimes it's escorting someone to safety. Sometimes it's joining a guard, a fellow inmate, or a random passerby in Baltimore in making it through a dangerous area. But sometimes it's something as benign as creating a path for someone, opening a cell, destroy an obstacle, or just making sure to leave someone alone, to not add to their stress and fear. And more importantly, in the Suffering, the morality doesn't determine the character's future. It's not the ending that you're building towards with your choices, but his past. Torque doesn't remember how his family died, and in Ties That Bind, he doesn't know the circumstances that led to the situation. It's only through your choices that it becomes apparent. Simply put, in the Suffering, the morality alignment tells you how Carmen, Corey, and Malcolm actually met their ends, and whether or not Torque had a hand in it. And in Ties That Bind, while the morality choices do have some effect on Torque's future, once again, they also answer a question about the past. If the Suffering asks what or how, then Ties That Bind answers why. But with that said, because you can transfer your save file from one game to the other, it means you can have up to 3 different starting points for Ties That Bind, and since it doesn't lock you into a path, you can shift your morality in the second game, leading to several possible combinations of endings. While Torque is very much a silent, stoic protagonist, save for a one-liner at the start of Ties That Bind, the rest of the cast is as colorful as it is creepy and disturbing. Foremost among them, of course, is Dr. Killjoy, the deranged alienist who, despite his horrific take on treatment and his rather disturbing methodology, is genuine in his efforts to help Torque. He sounds like a 1930s radio or contest host. He's bombastic, but not cartoonish. And it's the same with Ties That Bind's Creeper, who's just utterly, well, creepy. And then there's Blackmore, Torque's nemesis, a man that can only be described as intensely inhuman. Lastly, the sound. The fact the score and sound effects all use the same improvised instruments and materials means that at any point you can't be certain if what you're hearing is environmental or an indicator to the presence of danger. That sound of screeching metal could very well be the soundtrack, or it could mark the presence of slayers. And so that's yet another way that the Suffering keeps its atmosphere on at all times. Now, as much as I would like to tell you where the games can be acquired, as I've often done in other videos about the different series, the truth of the matter is that Warner Brothers, the current owners of the Suffering series, recently pulled both games from digital storefronts. And with little to no information, it's impossible to know if this makes the Suffering abandonware, or if there are plans on possibly releasing a remaster or even a new entry in the series. But if you do manage to get your hands on the Suffering games, I promise you an experience worth talking about, an exploration into choices and morality and the long-term consequences of violence, hatred, and, well, suffering. And that is it for me. And if there's one thing I can say, is that no one should suffer alone, and it's important to seek help when you need it. Just make sure the name of the plaque is not Dr. Killjoy.